When I entered the club today, the club owner also came into the dressing room. He handed me a costume, and just looking at it made me burn with shame. I turned to him with pleading eyes and said, I can't wear this. You have no idea how difficult it is for me to do this work. I don't have the courage to step out in front of so many men in such an outfit. The owner smiled strangely at my words and said, You signed a contract stating you'd do whatever work was assigned. You can't back out now. Otherwise, we can take legal action against you. I stood there, silent and stunned. Then he told me to put on the costume right away. Don't worry about anyone recognizing you. I'll make an exception in your case. You can wear a mask during your performance so your face won't be clearly identifiable, he offered. When I put on that outfit and looked at myself in the mirror, I was overwhelmed with shame. I couldn't even meet my own gaze. That's when the owner came back into the room. He stood there looking at me with admiring eyes that soon turned into something more unsettling. He stepped closer until he was right in front of me. Suddenly, he touched me in a way that made me jump back, feeling as though I'd been hit by a jolt of electricity. Yet he remained there, gazing at me as though he was entranced. At that moment, another woman entered the room to do my makeup. Throughout the process, the owner stayed put, his eyes fixed on me, making me increasingly nervous. After my makeup was done, my appearance was completely transformed. I put on a mesh mask that obscured my identity. While my face was visible, it wasn't easily recognizable. The makeup had already made me look so different that even someone who knew me would have trouble identifying me. Besides, I took solace in the fact that none of my friends or acquaintances would ever think of coming to a place like this. When I stepped onto the floor to dance, I was greeted by a sea of men. Their lustful stares bore into me, leaving me feeling exposed. In that moment, one of the men reached out and tugged at part of my outfit, tearing it. Suddenly, I found myself even more uncovered, and I panicked. The owner reassured me, promising, Don't worry, I won't let anyone get close to you again. I'll be right here. He then handed me a drink, urging me to take a few sips. Whenever I drank alcohol, I'd lose myself and keep dancing. If I remained sober, I would tire quickly. On nights when the owner planned to keep the show going late, he would have me drink until I was so intoxicated that I danced all night long, enduring both the lecherous stares and the occasional unwanted touch, things I couldn't bear in a sober state. I danced and danced, unaware of how much time had passed. When I finally woke up, I was horrified. I found myself lying naked in bed, surrounded by other people who were passed out, intoxicated. Seeing them and realizing what had happened, I broke down in tears. In that moment, I knew I had truly lost my dignity. As I tried to cover myself with a sheet, I fled back to the dressing room where my clothes were. Hastily putting them on, I then threw on a burqa and prepared to leave the club. Just as I reached the exit, the owner stopped me. Overcome with rage, I confronted him, saying, Do you have any idea what you've done to me? You've taken away the most precious thing I had. He simply smirked and responded, If that's so precious to you, I'll pay you for it. If you need this much money every day, just do as I say. He handed me an unusually large sum of cash, and I stood there, paralyzed. I left the club that night, but when I reached home and lay down in bed, my heart was filled with sorrow. I felt as though I was drowning in blood-tinged tears, questioning what had become of my life. Despite my reluctance, I was compelled to keep returning to the club. I had signed their contract, and backing out would mean they could entangle me in legal troubles. So I endured. Day by day, my costumes grew more revealing, to the point that my most recent outfit was barely clothing at all. I felt suffocated even before stepping onto the stage, but my circumstances left me with no choice. Then one day, the owner introduced a new girl to the lineup, and for the first time, let me leave early. Back in the dressing room, in my haste to change and go home, I didn't lock the door. As I removed my costume, I suddenly heard someone enter. I turned, startled, and before I could react, later that night, my sisters and I were jolted awake by our mother's cries. We rushed to her room and found her weeping beside my father's still, lifeless body. The sight shook us to our core. That entire night, we 4 women were alone, grieving, with no one to comfort us. The next morning, a few neighborhood women came by to offer condolences, but alongside the pain of my father's sudden passing, we were burdened by the grim reality of our financial situation. We didn't even have the money for his burial arrangements. My mother, weeping uncontrollably, begged these women for help, and they in turn looked at her in disbelief, muttering, "How could you be so careless? Every home should have some money set aside for emergencies like this." After my mother's tearful confession, she broke down, saying, "You all know my situation. For the past year, my husband has been bedridden. I've been working in people's homes just to feed my family. I'm already buried in debt. Where could I possibly save any money for emergencies?" Her words made me furious at those women's insensitivity and even more heartbroken at my mother's helplessness. Our life had become one of endless struggle, even for the most basic needs. In the end, some influential neighbors arranged for my father's burial and provided food for the few visitors who came to pay their respects. Once the funeral was over, everyone left and we were alone, just the four of us, lost and bewildered. My mother stared off into the distance, her gaze fixed on some invisible, black void. She couldn't comprehend how to move forward. The cupboards were bare, there wasn't a single rupee in the house, and now that she was in her period of mourning, she couldn't leave the house. I was the eldest of my sisters, so the responsibility fell on me. But I was just an 18-year-old girl, completely naive about the harsh realities of the world. Around this time, my mother's health began to decline. This brought on another wave of hardship. Left with no choice, I stepped outside our home in search of work. I had only completed my matriculation and decided to interview at a school, but they dismissed me outright, saying I wasn't qualified enough for any position. I tried several other places, only to be turned down each time. One day, feeling utterly defeated, I was walking home along the roadside when a car pulled up beside me. Inside was a middle-aged man. He looked me over from head to toe, taking in my worn-out burqa and broken sandals. Perhaps he sensed my desperation. That's when he rolled down his window and said, "If you're looking for work, I have a job for you." He mentioned a very attractive salary, and I lit up with hope. For so long, I had been searching for a job. We had nothing to eat at home and had reached the point of starvation. In that moment, this man seemed like an angel sent to help. He took me to a restaurant first. I was wary, but my hunger and need for a job compelled me to go along. When the food arrived, delicious, steaming dishes, I couldn't hold myself back and began eating hungrily. While I ate, the man sat silently across from me, his gaze fixed on my face. I avoided looking at him, concentrating solely on the food. Afterwards, he took me to a club. Once inside, he gestured toward the dancing girls and said, "This is the job I have for you. It pays very well." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I was a hafiza of the Quran. How could I even think of doing something like this? I told him as much, but he reassured me, saying, "You can wear a veil so no one will recognize you. And you won't have to wear revealing clothes. I'll make sure your outfit is modest. Don't worry, your transportation to and from here will also be taken care of." Tempted by his promises and unable to see any other way out of our financial crisis, I signed the contract without giving it much thought. In exchange, he gave me a considerable sum of money. I used it to buy groceries for our house and told my mother that I had found a job at a company. I didn't tell her the truth. I couldn't. When I first started my night shifts, I felt uneasy. My mother hesitated at the mention of night work, worried about what the neighbors and relatives would say. I tried to convince her by explaining that we had no other choice. "You're too ill, we have no source of income, and no one cares enough to help us," I told her firmly. Why should we care what others think when we're struggling to survive? We need to focus on ourselves now. She didn't respond, only gave me a pained look. But we both knew I had no other options. Soon, my routine became predictable. Every evening around 6, a car would pick me up. At first, I felt self-conscious leaving the house at that hour, but I learned to block out the stares and whispers. Over time, people in the neighborhood began to gossip. Boys who once avoided looking my way started making comments and catcalls. Still, I kept my head down and didn't let it bother me. I needed the money. At work, things were more challenging. The club's environment was something I had never imagined for myself. As I danced, men would touch me, and though I tried not to meet my own reflection in the mirrors, I couldn't avoid seeing how much my life had changed. My outfits, which started off relatively modest, grew more revealing with each passing week. The day they handed me an outfit so skimpy it barely covered anything, I felt myself shrink inside. But I wore it. Over time, even my embarrassment began to fade. As I started making more money, my guilt dulled. I had known hunger, the pain of wanting simple necessities and never having them. Now that I had money to care for my mother and cover our expenses, I convinced myself this was just another job. My mother's health remained fragile. She suffered from recurring kidney infections, and I used my earnings to pay for her treatments. Occasionally, she would ask me about my work. "What kind of job pays this well, my child?" she'd ask hesitantly. I would look away, telling her it was just a night shift that paid more than usual. "Don't worry," I'd reassure her. "I'd never do anything that would make you ashamed." As I said these words, I couldn't meet her eyes, picturing what she would think if she knew the truth. Some nights, my boss would give me alcohol to keep me going. Once the liquor took over, I would dance until dawn, feeling numb to the stares and gropes. Yet among all the faces, there was one that stood out. One man whose gaze didn't feel predatory. His eyes weren't like the others. When he looked at me, it felt different. There was a kindness there, an almost protective sadness that made me uncomfortable, but also drew me in. One night, I was changing in the dressing room when I heard the door open. Startled, I turned to see that same man standing there. He had entered by mistake, and when he saw me in my vulnerable state, he quickly turned his back. Embarrassed and angry, I threw on my clothes and demanded to know why he was there. His answer surprised me. "I need to talk to you," he said softly. It's important. I knew this could mean trouble. My boss had made it clear in the contract, no mingling with customers. This was the first time someone had dared to approach me so directly. My initial reaction was to drive him away, to tell him he shouldn't be there. But something about his demeanor, the way he looked at me with a mix of concern and sincerity, made me pause. In this environment where every interaction felt tainted, his approach seemed strangely out of place. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew his presence had already disrupted the fragile balance of my precarious life. Upon seeing me hesitate, he quickly reassured me, saying that my manager wasn't there and the owner would be out for a while longer. He seemed so certain, as if he'd prepared carefully before coming to me. His calm and measured tone made me pause. How did he know all these details, and why was he here now? My mind spun with suspicion. Was he here just to take advantage of me like everyone else? The thought stung. I had placed a sliver of trust in his gentle demeanor, but suddenly it felt like that trust was crumbling. As he stepped closer, his eyes locked on mine, and he said in a low, deliberate voice, "What you're doing isn't right. These people are dangerous. You may not realize it, but they're using you. They've done the same to countless other girls before you, promising them safety, but eventually selling them off." I blinked, stunned. He continued, "They've made deals to send some of them overseas. If you don't act quickly, you'll find yourself in that same situation." His words hit me like a bucket of cold water. My trust in the club's owner had always been thin, but hearing this man speak so candidly, as if he knew the dark underbelly of it all, sent shivers down my spine. He then gave me his number and said, "When you notice your boss acting strangely, or if he tells you he's taking you to meet someone, let me know immediately. Message me discreetly so no one notices. I'll help you." And then, without waiting for me to respond, he left. The rest of the night passed in a haze. My thoughts churned over his warning, and I couldn't shake the dread growing in my chest. Could he really be telling the truth? Why would he care enough to warn me? What proof did he have? The questions swirled around, keeping me restless. When the moment came, as he had predicted, my boss approached me with an offer to meet some important clients. My skin crawled at his forced smile and empty reassurances. I thought of the videos, the horrific scenes the stranger had shown me, the truth of how this operation worked. I remembered the way those men had pawed at the girls, including me, in those dim, smoky rooms. Though masked and unrecognizable, I had known it was me on that screen. The stranger had been right. This wasn't a job, it was a trap. I followed the stranger's instructions, sending him the message. When my boss led me to that shady meeting, the room was filled with sharp suits and lingering eyes. One man stepped closer, scrutinizing me like merchandise. I tried to shrink away, my body stiff as a board, but his hand reached out, grazing my shoulder. It felt as though a cold-blooded insect had scuttled across my skin. I froze in place, my breath hitching in my throat, a wave of revulsion crashing over me. I was sure he could see the fear etched on my face, but it didn't stop him. He leaned in closer. Before he could say or do anything more, the stranger appeared. It all happened so fast. There was shouting, a scuffle, and then chaos as the stranger and his companions moved swiftly, disarming the men who had thought themselves untouchable. I watched, my heart pounding, as the operation unraveled in front of me. When the authorities finally arrived, the entire scheme was exposed. I had thought my trust in the stranger was fragile, but now it seemed he had been my lifeline all along. Afterwards, as the smoke cleared, the stranger turned to me. "You're safe now," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle. For the first time in what felt like ages, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I took several steps back, overwhelmed by what was happening. Seeing my reaction, the people in the room burst out laughing. "We just touched her and she's already trembling. Imagine how she'll react when we put her to the real test," one sneered, and they all roared with laughter. I felt utterly helpless, my knees shaking under their harsh mockery. I glanced toward my boss, silently pleading for help, but he acted as though I was a stranger. It was as if he didn't even know me. Instead, I watched in disbelief as he accepted a large sum of money from one of the men, then prepared to leave. I tried to follow him, but before I could, another man grabbed me firmly by the arm. "You're not going anywhere," he said. His grip was tight, his eyes cold. I froze, unsure what to do. Just then, a commotion erupted as police officers stormed into the room. Everything happened so fast that I couldn't process it. One moment I was being pulled away, the next a female constable had taken hold of me, leading me out of that wretched place. She brought me straight to the police station. Even there, under the glaring lights, surrounded by a throng of unfamiliar faces, I was too ashamed to meet anyone's eyes. I was still wearing that humiliating outfit, clutching my arms tightly around myself. One of the female inspectors came over and, seeing my state, draped a shawl over me. Her kindness was unexpected, and for a brief moment, it eased my fear. Soon after, the young man I had encountered earlier at the club arrived. This time, he was in full police uniform. It turned out he wasn't just any man, he was an undercover officer. He had orchestrated the entire sting operation to catch the criminals who had ensnared me and others like me. That's when I realized he had never been like the rest of them. His intentions were noble, and because of his efforts, I was finally free from those who had sought to exploit me. For days afterward, I stayed home, haunted by the events, endlessly praying for forgiveness. I sought God's mercy, repenting for my sins and vowing never to stray again. Slowly, I rebuilt my life. With the little I had, I managed to open a small boutique. It wasn't much at first, but with hard work, it flourished. The boutique grew into something I could be proud of, something that allowed me to support my family without compromising my dignity. That chapter of my life became a distant memory, and I worked hard to ensure it stayed in the past. Years passed. My mother frequently brought up the topic of marriage, urging me to settle down. She would sit beside me, dreaming aloud about potential matches. Yet every time she mentioned it, I couldn't help but remember the nightmarish moments that still lingered in the back of my mind. I couldn't erase the image of those 5 men on that bed, the humiliation I had endured. The shame ran deep, and it kept me from seeing myself as worthy of a husband's love. Instead, I focused on ensuring my younger sisters didn't face the struggles I had endured. I made it my mission to see them married at the right time. I was determined to give them the stability and security I had longed for, knowing how important it was for girls to marry at the right age. I knew from experience how cruel society could be to women who had missed their chance. By God's grace, my sisters found good homes, leaving me to reflect on my journey, grateful that at least I could save them from the hardships I had faced.